Hello, I'm Nima Rajan. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says the federal wage subsidy program for employers hit by COVID-19 will have looser standards than previously announced. Rather than having to show a 30% decline in revenues, he says they can now show a 15% decline in March and can compare their revenues to previous months rather than the previous year. Charities can also choose whether to include revenues from governments in their calculations when they apply. He says businesses need to survive and workers need to get paid if the economy is to come roaring back after this crisis. Prime Minister Trudeau also announced that the federal government will cover 100% of wages for students hired under the Canada Summer Jobs Program. He says he hopes this will encourage businesses to hire students to allow them to get the work experience they need and earn incomes during the downturn. Last week, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives estimated 1/3 of unemployed Canadians won't get help from employment insurance or the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says thousands of Canadian companies have offered to help with the shortage of medical supplies needed to battle the COVID-19 pandemic. He praises the innovation of companies who have changed their production lines to manufacture everything from masks to surgical gowns to face shields. Trudeau says the government has ordered 30,000 ventilators from domestic companies, but he hopes that Canada won't need to use all of them. Now, a member of the federal government has tested positive for COVID-19. Marta Morgan, Canada's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. Several ministers and MPs have isolated themselves out of concern that they have the respiratory illness, but Ms. Morgan is the most senior Canadian government figure to test positive. Foreign Affairs Minister François-Philippe Champagne shared the diagnosis on Twitter and wished her a full and speedy recovery. Royal Canadian Legion branches across the country are launching online fundraising efforts to keep their doors open after suffering financial setbacks because of COVID-19. The head of the National Veterans and Community Service Group said this week that many branches are now turning to fundraising to simply pay the bills. Legion branches operate under strict rules concerning how they can spend the money they raise. Cash raised each year from the Poppy Fund must be spent locally on veterans. Well, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities is asking Ottawa for help to cover related cost overruns as the COVID-19 pandemic has diminished transit, parking, and recreational fee revenues. Toronto is losing about $65 million a week in revenues, while cities such as Edmonton and Ottawa have had to lay off staff as they face losses. Federation President Bill Karsten notes that cities cannot run deficits like other governments, and some have only enough reserves to cover expenses for 2 or 3 months at most. Now, another appeal of the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion is headed to Canada's highest court. First Nations from the Metro Vancouver and Fraser Valley regions, as well as the Coldwater Indian Band in south central BC, intend to challenge the federal government's second approval of the project. The Federal Court of Appeal ruled in February that Cabinet's June 2019 approval of the multi-billion-dollar project was reasonable, but First Nations say that it represents a major setback for reconciliation in Canada. Well, it looks like the Easter Bunny may need some help this weekend in the Maritimes. Environment Canada is forecasting up to 25 centimeters of snow for parts of New Brunswick on Thursday and Friday, as well as winds gusting up to 80 kilometers per hour. Up to 10 centimeters is expected in parts of Nova Scotia before it turns to rain on Friday. Prince County in PEI could see up to 15 centimeters of snow and high winds. Well, Senator Bernie Sanders, who saw his lead in the Democratic primary slide as the party supported rival Joe Biden, has decided to end his presidential bid today, acknowledging that the former vice president is too far ahead for him to have any hope of catching up. The Vermont senator's announcement makes Mr. Biden the presumptive Democratic nominee to challenge President Donald Trump in November. In the UK, Boris Johnson's spokesman said the British Prime Minister is responding to treatment but remains in intensive care with the coronavirus. Mr. Johnson has spent 2 nights in the ICU of St. Thomas Hospital in London. The 55-year-old Prime Minister was admitted to the hospital late Sunday, 10 days after being diagnosed with COVID-19, and was moved to the ICU on Monday night after his condition deteriorated. His illness has heightened public unease about the government's response to the virus. Global stock markets are mostly lower today in continuing uncertainty over the coronavirus outbreak. However, benchmark U.S. crude oil rose in electronic trading on the New York Mercantile Exchange after President Donald Trump told Fox TV that he expects Russia and Saudi Arabia to resolve their price war. A meeting of nations called OPEC Plus is scheduled for tomorrow. Well, during his morning mass at the Vatican, Pope Francis denounced the mafia and all those who are taking advantage of the coronavirus pandemic to make money. The Pope preached on the biblical story of Judas betraying Jesus, saying everyone has the capacity to betray, to sell others, and to choose our own interests. Italian officials have warned that organized crime groups are trying to profit off the social and economic disruptions caused by the country's lockdown. Meanwhile, the head of UNICEF says the COVID-19 pandemic has sparked an increase in online child sexual predators. Henrietta Fore is urging organizations, governments, and parents to take the threat more seriously. She says because children are online more, they are vulnerable to grooming, sexting, and trafficking. So UNICEF is talking with internet companies to see what they can do to combat the problem. In France, French counter-terrorism prosecutors have opened a judicial investigation after a knife attack south of Lyon left 2 people dead on Saturday. Prosecutors said charges will be pressed later Wednesday against the assailant, who was arrested by police minutes after the attack as he was kneeling on the sidewalk praying in Arabic. 2 people were killed and 5 were injured in Saturday's attack in the small town of Romans-sur-Isère, which was in lockdown amid the coronavirus pandemic. The Saudi king has ordered the suspension of rulings and judicial orders regarding visitation rights of children of separated parents. It's the latest effort to try and curb the spread of the coronavirus among households. The measure comes as the kingdom tries to stem the rising number of new infections. Saudi Arabia has 2,750 confirmed cases of the virus, including 41 deaths. This week, the kingdom began imposing a 24-hour curfew across much of the country. Well, BlackBerry says it has uncovered how China-backed hackers have been able to extract data from many of the world's servers. BlackBerry executive Eric Cornelius says the hackers have been skillful in disguising some of their software tools to appear like advertising software, which poses a low-level security risk. Mr. Cornelius says the tactics give the hackers the ability to extract information from huge amounts of valuable data on web servers using the Linux operating system. Coral bleaching is sweeping across Australia's Great Barrier Reef for the 3rd time in 5 years. Aerial surveys reveal bleaching caused by higher ocean temperatures has struck all 3 regions of the world's largest coral reef system and is more widespread than ever. The Great Barrier Reef has not been able to recover because there is not enough time between bleaching events. Well, some good news now. Zoo Miami is welcoming the births of 2 highly endangered clouded leopards. The zoo says the male and female have been secluded with their mother so that they could properly bond while avoiding external stress. Zookeepers took the kittens briefly on Tuesday to check their development and give them vaccines. Officials say they both appear to be thriving. Zoo spokesman Ron McGill says he hopes sharing their pictures can bring a smile to people's faces amid the stress of the coronavirus pandemic. Well, that'll do it for today's news update. I'm Nima Rajan. Thank you for joining us today, and I'll see you next time.